One wrong number, just one, and suddenly everything people thought they knew about Meghan Markle starts to shake in a way that nobody expected. Because this isn't just a rumor anymore, this is an actual printed detail, sitting quietly in an old magazine archive, waiting for someone to notice it, and when they finally did, it didn't just raise eyebrows, it ignited a full-blown storm that still hasn't settled.
Royal fans are convinced Meghan Markle is lying about her age. In fact, they think she's older.
Your age so wrong. Did you know that in 1997, when she met Yasmin Bleeth, when she claims that she was working for Humphrey Yogurt, age 13?
Page 90, a simple feature. Nothing dramatic, nothing explosive at first glance, just young people chasing dreams and entertainment, routine, harmless, forgettable. Except for one line that refuses to stay quiet, right next to Meghan Markle's name, the age printed was 21. Not 15, not even close, 21. A full 5-year gap from every official record that exists today. And here's where things stop. Being simple, because this wasn't a random blog, this wasn't a gossip site, this was a nationally circulated magazine, edited, reviewed, fact-checked, and somehow that number made it all the way to print. So now the question isn't just was it a mistake, the real question is how does a mistake like that survive every layer of verification, every editor, every approval, every check, and still end up published like it was never wrong to begin with? Because 5 years isn't a typo. It's not a small slip. It's a completely different timeline, and timelines matter when you're building a public identity that millions of people believe without question. And that's where things start getting uncomfortable, because once that one detail resurfaced, people didn't stop there. They started looking, really looking, not at headlines, not at polished interviews, but at the tiny pieces that usually get ignored, the small details that are supposed to stay consistent no matter how many times a story is told, and suddenly they weren't consistent anymore.
Let's actually get to the truth of this issue, and it's a surprise. Here we go. So, if you go over on Google, is she lying about her age? It currently says August 4th, 1981, that she is 41. Well, she would be 42 today.
Because when you step away from official biographies and listen to the people who knew her before the world did, the story begins to shift, not in one place, not once, but repeatedly. Different voices, different moments, different platforms, all pointing at the same thing. Something doesn't fully line up, and the most unsettling part, these voices aren't coordinated. They don't sound like a scripted attack. They sound like fragments of a story that never quite matched the version the public was given. And then it gets even more intense, because the spotlight moves from what others say to what she herself has said on record, in interviews, in moments that were supposed to feel natural and unscripted, and that's where the cracks become harder to ignore, because the smaller the detail, the harder it is to fake. Ages, timelines, first jobs, specific memories, these are the things that either stay solid or quietly collapse when checked.
That she's obviously missing out on a really good, tight-knit family. I mean, we're all still together all the time, no matter what.
Take something as simple as a teenage job. Something that's meant to make a story feel real, relatable, grounded, a detail you wouldn't question, because why would you until someone actually checks it? And suddenly the version told doesn't quite match what can be verified, and once that happens once, people start asking how many other details haven't been looked at closely enough. Then there's the pattern, and this is where it stops feeling random, because random mistakes don't move in one direction, they scatter. Sometimes older, sometimes younger, sometimes just inconsistent, but here, every detail seems to lean the same way. Older, consistently older, and that's what keeps this conversation alive. Not one mistake, but a pattern that refuses to behave like coincidence.
When I was just 11 years old, I unknowingly and somehow accidentally became a female advocate.
And just when it feels like the story has already reached its peak, something recent pulls everything back into focus. Something that doesn't look connected at first, but becomes impossible to ignore once you see the timing. Because while one part of the royal world was calm, controlled, composed, another moment appeared, polished, deliberate, perfectly timed, and suddenly the internet wasn't just talking, it was reacting.
You are the Duke of Cornwall.
So we need to put you to the test. We've got some scones here with some jam and clotted cream. I think you know where this is going.
Because this isn't just about an old magazine anymore. It's about awareness, about control, about knowing exactly when to step into the spotlight and when to stay silent. And here's the part that keeps people talking. On almost every controversy, every criticism, every narrative, there has been a response. Direct, indirect, subtle, or strong. But on this one topic, the magazine, the age, the timeline, nothing. Complete silence. And silence like that doesn't feel accidental, it feels chosen, especially when it comes from someone who has shown time and time again that they are more than capable of responding when they want to. So now the question shifts again, not just what is true, but why this silence? Why this? One detail out of everything remains untouched, unexplained, and completely unanswered. And this is where the story stops being just about a printed number on a forgotten page and starts turning into something far more layered, far more difficult to dismiss. Because once people followed that trail, they didn't just find one loose thread, they found multiple threads crossing the same narrow stretch of time, all pointing back to the same unanswered gap. And that gap is what keeps pulling attention back no matter how many times the conversation is shut down or labeled as speculation. Because speculation fades, but patterns don't. And what people began to notice next was not a single claim, not a single rumor, but a cluster of claims that all seemed to circle the exact same years. Because alongside the magazine detail, there were discussions about documents, about records that should have been easy to locate but somehow weren't, about files that people claimed existed but could not be accessed through normal channels. And this is where the tone shifts again. Because one missing document is nothing, it happens all the time. Records get misplaced, archives get incomplete, but when multiple records tied to the same period become difficult to trace, difficult to confirm, or reportedly sealed, that's when people stop calling it coincidence and start calling it a pattern. And patterns create pressure, not because they prove anything directly, but because they refuse to disappear quietly. And then comes the part that made the conversation explode again in certain corners of the internet. The part that people keep returning to even when everything else fades. Because it's not just about words anymore, it's about an image. Something that has circulated long enough to become familiar to those tracking the story. Something that doesn't vanish permanently. Something that reappears at very specific moments, almost as if it's tied to the rise of the same debate every single time. And that timing alone has become its own mystery, separate from whatever the image may or may not show. Because people aren't just asking what it is, they're asking why it comes back exactly when it does. And here's where it becomes even more complicated, because attempts have been made, not official, not verified by independent authorities, but attempts nonetheless to analyze that image, to test whether it was manipulated, altered, artificially created, and according to one analysis that circulated widely, the result claimed a high level of authenticity, not absolute, not confirmed beyond doubt, but high enough to keep the conversation alive, high enough that people couldn't just dismiss it and move on, and yet not strong enough to settle anything definitively, leaving the story suspended in that uncomfortable space between possibility and proof. What makes it even more intense is that every time the image resurfaces, the reactions follow the same script almost instantly. Dismissals, defenses, counterclaims, all appearing within hours, almost like a reflex. And that repetition has become part of the story itself. Because when reactions are predictable, they stop being just reactions and start looking like a pattern, and once again, it's the pattern that keeps people watching, not necessarily the content. Then there's the discussion about a possible marriage record, something tied to the mid-1990s, something that, if placed against the official timeline, creates a scenario that doesn't sit comfortably with what has been publicly accepted. Because depending on which version of the timeline you follow, the implications shift dramatically. And yet, once again, the same wall appears. The same inability to verify, the same claim that the document is sealed or inaccessible, and that repetition, the same barrier appearing again and again whenever the story reaches a point where it could be settled, is what fuels the sense that this isn't just random noise. And hovering over all of this, above every claim, every contradiction, every resurfacing detail, is one thing that has never changed: the absence of a direct, clear, undeniable response to the original question, the one that started everything, the number on that page. Because in a world where almost every controversy is addressed, challenged, clarified, or denied, this one has remained untouched, not corrected, not explained. not even casually dismissed in a way that would allow the conversation to close. And that silence, more than anything else, is what keeps the story alive, because silence invites interpretation, and interpretation multiplies, and once it multiplies, it spreads, and once it spreads, it becomes something that no longer depends on proof to survive. It depends on curiosity, on doubt, on the simple fact that people don't like unanswered questions, especially when those questions sit in plain sight, visible, accessible, and yet still unresolved after all this time. Because in the end, this was never just about whether the number was wrong or right, whether the difference was 5 years or nothing at all. It became about something much larger, the idea that a public identity, once established, is expected to align perfectly with the details that support it. And when even one detail refuses to align, it creates a gap, and once that gap is noticed, it doesn't close on its own. It stays there, quietly, waiting for the next moment, the next trigger, the next resurgence, ready to pull the entire conversation back into the spotlight all over again.